Howdy folks, it's Asia the Hunting Gear Guy. Today I wanted to show you guys the differences between the Shadow 2 and the Shadow 1. These are two primarily pistols for IPSC and competition made by CZ, and they're pretty interesting. There's a lot of similarities between the two of them, but a lot of guys out there are wondering which one to buy because the Shadow 1s are right around $700-800, whereas the Shadow 2s are right around $1,200. So there's quite a big price difference between the two. So why don't we take a closer look at what makes these two pistols different. Now, I do this on every one of my videos. I'm going to check to make sure that they're empty. That guy's empty there. And the Shadow 2 is empty as well. So we have two empty guns, and we are clear to shoot a video. Now, when we talk about these two pistols, the primary difference between them is, at least in my opinion, is weight. The Shadow 2 is considerably heavier, and if you look at how they designed it, a lot of the design you can see is made for weight. You'll notice this guy has a couple of different cuts in the dust cover there for different mounting options, whereas this one just has one. Now you could look at that and say like, oh, well, it's cost savings, but it's also letting them just keep a little bit more weight on there. So definitely a lot more weight on the lower part of this Shadow 2 and a much heavier gun. But just aside from that, why don't we take a little closer look at some of the differentiating outside feature of these things. One is the sights. The Shadow 2 uses a smaller filament on the fiber optic than the Shadow 1. The Shadow 2 is also higher. The sight is higher compared to the Shadow 1. So both of these are a little bit higher. Now, why they went with a higher one? I mean, they got a little bit more adjustability on the back sight, which is kind of interesting. The rear sight on the Shadow 2 it angles in rather than just going straight. Here, let me see if I can get that sight picture going for you guys. There we go. So it's a little bit of it's not flat or squared away on the back, whereas on the Shadow 1, it very much is. So it's squared away at the back here, and that front sight is a little bit larger. So a little bit different sight picture between the two. I wouldn't say like massively different to the point where, you should buy one over the other. Both fiber optics are easy enough to find and replace, so not usually not a huge difference there. Now, the Shadow 2 is adjustable for elevation very easily. It's got that adjustment screw on top. So technically speaking, you can adjust it for windage as well by loosening off these screws and then hitting it one way or the other. So these sights are adjustable, whereas on the Shadow 1, they're not as adjustable. It's fixed for elevation, and it's got that little set screw in there that kind of lets you hit it back and forth. So that's more of a set it and forget it kind of a setup, whereas this has got a little bit of adjustability. Say you change ammo and one of them hits quite a bit differently at 50 meters or 50 yards compared to the other. So a little bit of a difference there. The Shadow 2 has a slightly longer barrel, but not really a whole heck of a lot. I'll show you guys that later. One of the big differences is on the cut that they put into the Shadow 2. So the Shadow 2 has an under trigger cut here, and it goes up a little bit higher on the beaver tail here. So the purpose of that is to get your gun higher up on the frame, so that as the gun recoils, you're better able to control that recoil impulse. On the Shadow 1, it doesn't have those same cuts on the front and back, so your hand's going to sit just a little bit lower down instead of higher up on the gun. So there might be a little bit more flip to the Shadow 1 than there is a Shadow 2. Again, a very small difference. Primarily, you should try both of these out for fit, especially if you're an experienced shooter. If you're not really an experienced shooter, you might not want to trust some of your gut on some of this stuff. But any case, that's one thing to look for. The other thing that's one of the bigger things that's different here, the mag releases are different. So on the Shadow 1, it uses this oval kind of a shaped mag release. I have big hands, so I have no problem hitting that guy. I'm covering that magazine release there. But if you've got shorter hands or shorter fingers or shorter thumbs, I don't know, the Shadow 1's still pretty easy to get to. The Shadow 2 has an adjustable magazine release. You can see there it's well textured. It's pretty easy to grab. Now, one thing that I will note about the Shadow 1 is that it's possible to over press the magazine release if you get really ham-handed with it, and what that'll do is actually hold on to the magazine and not want to let it out. There is a mod, which I've already done to this one, that makes it see that's not possible to over press the magazine release, but it's just something to take note of, I guess. On the Shadow 2, no such problem exists. You can press that thing down and it'll still let go quite easily. Now, a couple of things on the grip to take note of. The Shadow 1s, they'll come with these rubber grips. There is a bit of a contour right here for them. And there's a little bit of checkering kind of on the front here and as well on the back, but it's more of like a little square that's kind of like molded in there. It's not particularly sharp on these, so it's not going to do a ton for your grip. Now you can just get some skateboard tape and pop that on there and you're good to go, but the Shadow 2 has a very large patch of knurling here, and it's very sharp, so that's very different than the measly little molded in piece that the Shadow 1 has. And the differences extend to the back as well. On the Shadow 2, again, nice big patch of knurling on there, whereas the Shadow 1 has just a little patch of mostly molded in, not very sharp. This one's quite sharp. Not so sharp that it's like one of the sharper finishes you can do on a pistol is like a silicon carbide job. Not nearly that bad, but still sharp enough where it's going to be gripping in your hand quite nicely. Now, still on some of the differences, you'll notice that the hammers are a little bit different here. I think this is just a cool factor. I mean, the Shadow 1 has just a regular rounded hammer. The Shadow 2 has this cooler looking kind of target-ish hammer on it. So it just looks neat. I don't know if it actually adds anything to the, your ability to roll that thing in. Most people, when they're doing IPSC, will pop their thumb in front of it, pull the trigger, and then roll their finger out. Or you could also do the 2 fingers over top kind of thing if you want to be real careful. Or you can do the single finger thing. Now, the disadvantage with that single finger thing is if it slips, it's going to go off because you're holding the trigger down, right? The Shadow 1, it's a little bit harder to grab onto because it doesn't have that flat shelf up there, but it's still easy enough to control over the top. And again, same thing with this one. You can do those different methods of decocking it if you're shooting in IPSC. Now, in terms of the safeties, the Shadow 1 comes stock with these fairly extended safeties that are pretty easy to use, pretty easy to move back and forth. They don't really offer much of a shelf to put your thumb on, so if you're going to fire with those 2 thumbs forward and keep that your right-hand thumb on the safety, it's not really much to grab onto. You can see there on my thumb, it's just a little shelf. The Shadow 2 will come with either these really thin, practically non-existent safeties, or some of them come with the extended ones, or you can buy the extended ones afterwards. Now, those extended ones are a lot larger, and the idea with these thin ones, if you're going to be shooting IPSC production, you actually never use your safety. Whenever you load your gun, you're always going to decock it, and your safety is going to be off. If you're going to get into 3-gun, you may want to consider the extended safety, or maybe not. One of the guys that I was talking to that shoots 3-gun with a Shadow 2 said he dumped his pistol in a dump receptacle, and it actually hit the extended safety and flipped it off, and that got him. I can't remember if he said it was a penalty or a DQ. It depends in 3-gun, but one thing that is worth considering for 3-gun is whether you want to run that extra large safety and accidentally hit it off, or you're going to go with the thin guys and maybe just decock it when you holster it. Now, in terms of magwell, there is not really much of a difference. The Shadow 1's got a little bit more of a tapered edge towards the front here, whereas that Shadow 2 doesn't really have that same taper, but otherwise they're both good magwells to be used. Now, just because some people will be wondering, they actually use the same magazines. The ones that come with the Shadow 1 are these half plastic, half metal ones. The ones that come with the Shadow 2 are typically these Mechgar ones. These are Canadian Mechgar ones. They're pinned to 10 rounds of 9mm, but in the States those will hold 17 rounds. And I like the Metgar ones better because they're all metal except for like a little plastic floor plate, which you can change out very easily, right? Nice and positive insertion, a little bit of a bevel on the bottom here. And with the Shadow 1, same magazine, and it works as well. So any of these CZ75 mags will work between these guns. Now, I mean, weight's the real big difference between these two. Let's pop this Shadow 2 on here. That one's coming at 43.3 ounces, whereas the Shadow 1 is coming in at 38 ounces. So there's a decent size difference there. Let's just swap units just in case we have anyone who uses a measurement system that makes sense. There's the Shadow 2 at 1.2 kilos. And there's the Shadow 1 at 1.08 kilos. So again, there is a difference on the weight. And
now you might say that's not that much weight, but a lot more of that is actually in the frame of the Shadow 2, and especially towards the front of the frame. So that keeps a lot of that weight lower. And again, that does a little bit in helping with the recoil mitigation.
Now, takedown is similar on both guns. You're going to line up those hash marks and press in this this pin here. The easiest way to press that pin is to use the base of your magazine. So you can just grab that like that. I've got those marks lined up, and then press in with your magazine. Whoops, did I press in from the middle? I did. There we go. Now you can pull out that cross pin. Release the sear, and away she goes. Same thing on the Shadow 2. We're going to get those hash marks lined up. Press in from the side on the magazine. And then pull up on the slide stop. And release the hammer. And away she goes. Alright, so here's our Shadow 2 slide in upper. I'm going to say upper. Upper, you'll notice that it comes with a buffer installed from the factory. So they are intending these to be used with like a light recoil spring and slam that buffer a little bit. It's got a stainless steel guide rod in there, whereas the Shadow 1 has a plastic one. So just before we get into stripping these too much, let's look at the just the slide and barrel. There's 526 grams on the Shadow 2, and there's 466. So the Shadow 2 one is heavier, but not substantially. So why don't we take a look at the lowers on here? Shadow 1 lower is 606 grams. Sorry, that was Shadow 1. Shadow 2, 692. So again, we've got more weight with that Shadow 2 and more weight lower down. All right, why don't we disassemble these? Let's start with the Shadow 2 this time. So it's going to pop out of there. There's our recoil spring. There's that stainless steel guide rod inside there as well. And then there's our barrel. So I'll pop the Shadow 1 barrel next to it. Let's pull that recoil spring assembly out. And I'll just pop it over here by that Shadow 1. So you can see that the spring length is about the same. It's just a cheaper assembly compared to this nicer one with the stainless steel guide rod and the buffer on there. And there's our barrel. So you might want to know if there's a difference there, and you'll see that yes, the Shadow 2 is a little bit longer a barrel than the Shadow 1. Now, in terms of the insides of the gun, they're pretty similar. There's some design changes on the insides here. One thing that I saw really quickly, take a look at how thick this metal is on here compared to the Shadow 1. So in the Shadow 2, we're definitely getting a lot more weight right up front on the gun and on this lower part of the frame. It's really going to help with the controllability on it. Now, reassembly is the same on both guns. I'll show you the Shadow 2 here. Pop in your barrel, grab your recoil assembly there, pop it in. Now on the Shadow 1, you might have to or Shadow 2 rather, you might have to wiggle around until that steel guide rod gets into that hole there. And then we pop our slide on. I like to cock the hammer, line up those two notches there, and then pop in our slide stop. 3 pounds, 2 ounces. So pretty similar trigger pulls between the two. Why don't we just compare the travel that we're getting? So if you'll notice, the Shadow 2 has less travel in that single action. I'm just trying to get this over. If you see that large amount of action there compared to the smaller amount there, there is a bit more of a pull on the Shadow 1. Let's see if it holds true for reset. Here, let me move it so you can see here. Pretty short reset. I mean, part of what makes these pistols really great is the short reset on them, and fantastic single action trigger. There it goes. It's not bad. And on the Shadow 2. The Shadow 2 has a less distance on the reset, I would say. Definitely a lot less distance there too. I feel like this is something that someone has measured with real tools, other than I think it feels like it's shorter. So which of these pistols is better? Well, clearly the Shadow 2 is the better pistol. The question really should be, is it good enough for the price? And I think that's hard to say, because I mean they're both really good. They're both fantastic pistols. They're both really well represented in IPSC in production shooting, because they're both very capable pistols, very heavy pistols. They've got great triggers on them, and reloads are pretty good because they both got really good magwells on them. So they're both, again, both great pistols. The question is, $1,200 best pistol for production, or $800 pretty good pistol for production? I think if you were starting out, it's really hard to go wrong with the Shadow 1. For the price difference there, you can get your holster, your belt setup, magazines, mag pouches, maybe even some ammo in there as well, and that makes the Shadow 1 really attractive, especially if you're just getting into this and you haven't quite figured out what you want to do yet. Man, it's like fantastic pistol for the price. But if you're like pretty sure like IPSC's going to be your thing, or you're going to want to do IPSC and 3-gun, the Shadow 2 is quite a bit heavier. And again, you can get, like, some guys will throw tungsten guide rods and some other stuff onto the Shadow 1 to try to beef them up and make it heavier, but you could just get the gun that has all the weight in it already and has it in a really nice spot, and you'd be a little bit further ahead. So I hope that's helped out with you guys with picking between the Shadow 2 and the Shadow 1. Again, both great pistols, and I think you'd be well served with really either of them. Thanks for watching.